Cuba's earliest inhabitants were indigenous peoples who arrived from the South American mainland thousands of years ago. The Taino, Siboney, and Guanahatabi were the three main groups that populated the island. The Taino were the most numerous and advanced, establishing agricultural settlements and developing sophisticated social structures. They cultivated yucca, corn, and tobacco, and lived in organized villages led by caciques. The Siboney inhabited the western regions, while the Guanahatabi were primarily hunter-gatherers in the westernmost areas. These indigenous populations had developed complex religious beliefs, artistic traditions, and trade networks throughout the Caribbean. They created petroglyphs, pottery, and ceremonial objects that reflected their deep connection to the natural world. The population at the time of European contact is estimated to have been between 100,000 and 200,000 people. Christopher Columbus first landed in Cuba on October 28, 1492, during his first voyage to the Americas. He claimed the island for Spain, naming it Juana after Prince Juan, son of the Catholic monarchs. The Spanish began systematic colonization in 1511 under Diego Velázquez de Cuellar, who established the first permanent settlements including Baracoa, Santiago de Cuba, and Havana. The indigenous population suffered catastrophically under Spanish rule. Disease, forced labor, and violence decimated the native peoples within decades. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous labor, leading to widespread exploitation. By 1550, the indigenous population had been virtually eliminated, creating a severe labor shortage that would drive the importation of African slaves. Cuba became a crucial way station for Spanish treasure fleets traveling between the Americas and Europe. Havana's strategic location made it the gathering point for the annual treasure convoy, leading to the development of impressive fortifications like El Morro and La Cabana. The city grew wealthy from this trade, becoming one of the most important ports in the Spanish Empire. The colonial economy initially relied on cattle ranching, tobacco cultivation, and small-scale agriculture. However, the introduction of sugarcane in the 16th century would transform Cuba's economic landscape. Sugar plantations expanded rapidly, particularly after the Haitian Revolution, eliminated Haiti as a sugar competitor, and sent French planters fleeing to Cuba with their expertise and capital. By the 18th century, Cuba had become the world's largest sugar producer, earning the nickname Pearl of the Antilles. This prosperity came at an enormous human cost, built on the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. The slave trade brought approximately 800,000 Africans to Cuba between 1511 and 1867, creating a diverse population that would profoundly influence Cuban culture, religion, and identity. Cuban independence movements began in earnest during the 19th century. The 10 Years' War marked the first major independence struggle, led by Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, who freed his slaves and proclaimed Cuban independence at his plantation in Yara. The war featured notable figures like General Maximo Gomez and the mulatto general Antonio Macchio, known as the Bronze Titan. Though the 10 Years' War ended in Spanish victory with the Pact of Zanjan, it had weakened Spanish control and inspired continued resistance. The Guerra Chiquita of 1879 to 1880 was a brief but unsuccessful uprising that demonstrated persistent independence sentiment. The final and most successful independence war began in 1895, led by the intellectual and poet José Martí, who is revered as Cuba's national hero. Martí founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party and coordinated the uprising from exile before dying in battle shortly after landing in Cuba. The war continued under military leaders like Macchio and Gomez, who employed guerrilla tactics that proved effective against Spanish forces. The Spanish-American War of 1898 proved decisive. The mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor provided the United States with a pretext to intervene. American forces, though less experienced than the Cuban independence fighters, helped tip the balance. The Treaty of Paris ended Spanish colonial rule, but Cuba passed from Spanish to American control rather than achieving immediate independence. Cuba gained formal independence on May 20, 1902, but with significant restrictions, and established naval bases. The Platt Amendment, incorporated into the Cuban Constitution, granted the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. This created a relationship of dependence that would define Cuban-American relations for decades. The early Republican period was marked by political instability, corruption, and continued economic dependence on sugar exports to the United States. Presidents like Tomás Estrada Palma, José Miguel Gómez, and Mario García Menecal struggled to build stable institutions while navigating American pressure and domestic challenges. The 1920s brought both prosperity and crisis. The Dance of the Millions saw sugar prices soar during World War I, creating enormous wealth for plantation owners. However, the subsequent price collapse devastated the economy and led to increased American economic penetration. American companies owned much of Cuba's sugar industry, utilities, and railroads. Political instability culminated in the dictatorship of Gerardo Machado, whose increasingly authoritarian role sparked widespread opposition. Student protests, labor strikes, and revolutionary movements eventually forced Machado from power in 1933. The resulting political chaos saw multiple governments rise and fall until Fulgencio Batista, a sergeant who had led a military revolt, emerged as the power behind the throne. Batista dominated Cuban politics for the next 2 decades, sometimes as president, sometimes as the power behind civilian presidents. His rule brought some modernization and economic growth, but also increased corruption and inequality. The 1940 Constitution was progressive for its time, establishing social rights and democratic institutions, but political practice often fell short of constitutional ideals. Fidel Castro's revolutionary movement began with a failed attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba on July 26, 1953. Castro and his followers, including his brother Raúl, were captured and imprisoned. During his trial, Fidel delivered his famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech, which became a revolutionary manifesto. The revolutionaries trained and prepared for their return to Cuba. Released in 1955 under a general amnesty, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he organized the 26th of July movement. In Mexico, he met Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who would become a key figure in the Cuban Revolution. The survivors, including Castro, Raúl, and Guevara, fled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they began guerrilla warfare against Batista's forces. In December 1956, Castro, Guevara, and 80 other revolutionaries landed in Cuba aboard the yacht Granma. The landing was a near disaster, with most of the force killed or captured. The guerrilla campaign gradually gained support from peasants and urban revolutionaries. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and the revolutionaries marched triumphantly into Havana. International opinion turned against Batista, and the United States eventually withdrew support. The rebels established liberated zones, implemented land reform, and built popular support. Meanwhile, Batista's forces became increasingly demoralized and corrupt. The revolutionary forces launched their final offensive in 1958. Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos led columns that captured key cities in central Cuba, while Castro's forces advanced from the east. The early years of the revolution were marked by radical social and economic transformation. The new government implemented sweeping land reform, nationalizing large estates and redistributing land to peasants. Literacy campaigns virtually eliminated illiteracy within a few years. Healthcare and education became free and universal, leading to dramatic improvements in social indicators. However, revolutionary changes also created conflict with the United States. The nationalization of American-owned properties, Cuba's growing ties with the Soviet Union, and the execution of Batista supporters strained relations. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, organized by the CIA using Cuban exiles, pushed Cuba firmly into the Soviet sphere. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union's placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba led to a tense standoff with the United States. The crisis was resolved when the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for American pledges not to invade Cuba and to remove missiles from Turkey. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Cuba underwent socialist transformation. Private property was largely eliminated, and the state controlled the economy. Cuba also became active in international revolutionary movements, supporting liberation struggles in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Cuban forces played crucial roles in conflicts in Angola, Ethiopia, and Nicaragua. The Soviet alliance provided Cuba with economic subsidies, military protection, and trade partnerships that sustained the Cuban Revolution despite the American embargo imposed in 1962. However, this relationship also created economic dependence that would prove problematic when the Soviet Union collapsed. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 plunged Cuba into its worst economic crisis since the revolution. The special period in time of peace saw a GDP fall by 35%, food shortages, blackouts, and social hardship. The government was forced to implement market-oriented reforms, including limited private enterprise, foreign investment, and tourism development. Cuba legalized the use of foreign currency, allowed small private businesses, and opened farmers' markets. Tourism became a crucial source of foreign exchange, with the government developing beach resorts and heritage tourism in colonial cities like Havana and Trinidad. Despite economic difficulties, Cuba maintained its achievements in healthcare and education. The country continued to boast some of the world's best health indicators, and Cuban doctors began serving in international missions worldwide. Cuba also developed biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries, creating vaccines and treatments that gained international recognition. Fidel Castro stepped down as president in 2008 due to illness, transferring power to his brother Raul Col. Raul Castro implemented gradual economic reforms, expanding private enterprise, relaxing travel restrictions, and encouraging foreign investment. The government also began releasing political prisoners and allowing more open debate about economic policy. The relationship with the United States began to change under President Barack Obama, who initiated a diplomatic opening in 2014. This led to the restoration of diplomatic relations, Obama's historic visit to Cuba in 2016, and the easing of some travel and trade restrictions. Cuba has faced new challenges, including increased American sanctions, the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on tourism, and growing economic difficulties. However, this progress was largely reversed under President Donald Trump, who tightened the embargo and added new restrictions. Raul Castro stepped down as president in 2018, replaced by Miguel Díaz-Canel, the first non-Castro to lead Cuba since the revolution. Díaz-Canel has continued gradual reforms while maintaining the socialist system. In 2021, Cuba experienced its largest protests since the revolution, with thousands demonstrating over economic conditions and political freedoms. The government responded with arrests and restrictions while also acknowledging the need for economic reforms. These events highlighted the ongoing tensions between the desire for change and the government, commitment to maintaining socialist rule. Today, Cuba continues to navigate the challenges of economic development, political change, and international relations while preserving its unique revolutionary identity and achievements in social development.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.